Hi friends, welcome to the Eastern Front channel. Today we will talk about the memoirs of Friedrich Paulus adjutant Wilhelm. He fought with Paulus until he was captured in 1943. Let's try together to understand the reasons for the defeat of Paulus' army in Stalingrad. As our next destination, Shumilov had allotted the front headquarters, which roughly compared with our headquarters. Our vehicle rattled over the battlefield between the Volga and the Don, the night shrouding the horrors of the scene as an icy wind penetrated our vehicle. Hunched together, I sat in a corner of the rear seat next to our staff interpreter with two Soviet officers in front of me. I was able to orientate myself from the starry sky. We were driving in a northerly direction, but not for long before the vehicle stopped. Pocket torches flashed at a checkpoint. Our escorting officers answered the questions asked. Everything was in order. The vehicle drove on. We experienced these stops and starts several times during the night's journey. The roads were constantly blocked with barricades. I had to think about our officers' escape plan. They would have no chance with such rigid controls. Our small convoy stopped again and I heard my name being called. An officer entered our vehicle and asked me to accompany him. His tone was less friendly. I followed him with my heart thumping. At the head of the column, I was told to get into a small cross-country vehicle, and I had hardly sat down, squeezed in between two officers on the back seat, when it drove off again. There was soon nothing to be seen of the other vehicles. Despite the experience with General Shumilov, I was uneasy. I felt better again when several vehicles appeared behind us at the next stop, in one of which I recognized Paulus. We had been underway in this cutting cold since 1500 hours, crushed and half frozen in these vehicles without being able to move much. It was coming up to midnight when I was finally able to climb out in front of a small wooden house. While I was getting out of the vehicle, I noticed that Paulus and Schmidt had left their vehicle. Together we approached a Soviet staff officer standing in front of the building, which was guarded by sentries at each corner. The door opened from inside. The first thing I noticed upon entering was a comfortable warmth. A young senior lieutenant greeted us in German. He explained to Paulus and Schmidt that they should occupy a large room in which there were 2 beds, a table, and several chairs. My sleeping place was in the first room opposite the door of the bricked-in stove, which extended deep into the room allocated to the 2 generals. While our frozen bodies were slowly thawing in the pleasant warmth, a senior officer entered the room and asked Paulus and Schmidt to go with him to the front headquarters, where they were expected by Generals Rokossovsky and Voronov. Meanwhile, the senior lieutenant talked about Moscow, his home city in which he had studied architecture. He talked about the Kremlin, the metro, and the theaters. As I expressed my wonder at his command of the German language, I received the information that was later even more frequently encountered in similar form. Many of us learned German, the language of Marx and Engels. I would like to recommend to you that you learn Russian during your captivity. Shortly after 2 a.m. a car brought Paulus and Schmidt back. I learned from them that the interview had followed the same formalities and questions as had occurred with the staff of the Soviet 64th Army. As before in Byktovka, Paulus asked the commander-in-chief of the Soviet front for the utmost possible help and care for surviving German soldiers and officers. The Soviet general replied, "Of course there is not for today or tomorrow sufficient supplies for 90,000 additional mouths, but we will do everything humanly possible for them." We were dead tired and sought to go to bed as soon as possible. I was first awake in the morning when the senior lieutenant gave me a shake. On the morning of the 1st February, we were able to walk around a bit with the senior lieutenant. We did not learn the name of the place that we were in. Our questions about it were met with a shrug of the shoulders. It was unimportant. We were much more interested in the fact that all the surviving generals of the 6th Army would assemble here in the next few days. We were separated from them by a field, so we did not get together with them. But we could watch them taking a daily walk from our little house. During our first days as prisoners of war, the unusual peace and regular meals, I gradually lost the stupefaction and tenseness that had crippled me during the last days in the cauldron. Much more, I felt the burden of being hemmed in. Here in this village we had no newspapers or books available. We sat at the table for hours, each busy with his thoughts. Even a look through the window at the level, single-colored snowy landscape could not lighten our dreary mood. Paulus was at the end of his strength. On the 5th or 6th February we were moved, but only for 2 or 3 days, then we had to prepare to travel again. Trucks brought all the Sixth Army's prisoner of war generals to one of the railway lines passing near the place. On an open stretch by a station master's house was a train, in the middle of which a carriage had been kept free. We were somewhat astounded at the bed sheets, blankets, and white-covered pillows in the sleeping part of the carriage. An old woman acted as interpreter. Through her, the train commandant greeted Paulus and informed him about the situation at the front. We also discovered that there were officers of our army in the other wagons, but nevertheless we were not allowed to make contact. Where were we going? We dared not ask. During the night I stood for some time at the window of our darkened compartment. Larger and smaller settlements went by. They showed no signs of destruction. Only the many troop transports rolling to the front reminded one of the war. Our train rolled along slowly and was often shunted into sidings. Things came alive early in the general's wagon. The washing and shaving took longer. Then the attendant brought hot tea into the carriage. I took breakfast with Schmidt in Paulus's section. When I looked out of the window again, my eyes found a changed landscape. The dirty gray snow-covered steppe had vanished. Vast woods in their proud winter clothing extended far off on either side of the railway, frequently broken by settlements at whose stations business activity was being conducted. Women in long rows offered the products of the countryside: bread, chickens, milk, butter, and many other things needed by people on long journeys. Soldiers on the troop trains and travelers on the regular train services had a brisk need for the items on offer. Every stop at the stations was used to obtain hot water in the tea urns at special taps. Unfortunately, I was unable to decipher the place names at the stations, as I did not know the Cyrillic alphabet. Now and then curious civilians tried to get near our train when we stopped, but they were held back at a respectful distance by our guards. I observed a few scowls from this or that Soviet citizen at those who had devastated their country and brought death to many, but I noticed no offensive gestures against us. How long we traveled I no longer know, but it could have been 2 or 3 days and nights. One morning we stopped at a station and were told to prepare to leave the train. "Another short journey by bus, and you will be at your destination," said the train commander to the field marshal. And so it was. We drove through a town, but there was not much to see. My general impression was of a little country town, like many I had got to see during the war. After a few minutes our bus stopped before a closed, high wooden gate. To the right of it stood a little wooden house. A high barbed wire fence stretched away on both sides. We were in front of the Krasnogorsk prisoner of war camp near Moscow. Proper camp life was about to begin. The camp commandant and duty officer emerged from the guard room and asked us to follow some of the guards along the road through the camp. On the right side were 3 long barrack huts. On the left was a small hut, the cookhouse, which we soon came to. Beyond the cookhouse were another log hut and a barrack hut. Some shelters could be made out further along. The arrival of the Stalingrad generals naturally caused a sensation among the old prisoners of war. Curiously, they stood in aprons and white caps in front of the kitchen, or leaned out of the barrack hut windows. The camp did not seem to be strongly occupied. On the third hut on the right of the street was the word ambulatorium. It seemed that this housing even had back doors. We entered one of them and waited in a large room for further developments. This gave me an opportunity to look around. On the door was a notice in the German language. Under the heading, "Extract from the Orders of the People's Commissar for Defense," I read, "Hitler's come and go, but the German people remain." I had heard similar words on the 31st January during our interview with General Shumlov. Somehow it impressed me more at that time. Now I believed, just as the generals also did, that it could be dismissed as propaganda. Had I been influenced by being together with them every day, usually sounding arrogant and dismissive? Apparently, in any case, these words would haunt me during the coming months and years. After bathing and delousing, we were divided up among the barracks. Paulus, Schmidt, and I were allocated a room in the log hut. In a large room of this building lived 6 Romanian generals, and in a smaller room were 3 Italians. Apart from them, the camp also housed further officer prisoners of war as well as other ranks. German doctor prisoners of war worked in the ambulatorium under the charge of a female Soviet doctor. At first, captivity encompassed a kind of stress and expectation. With a certain agitation, we regarded the unknown and the uncertainty. But this feeling vanished quickly in the sense of regularity. Getting up, 3 meals a day, walks, afternoon and night sleeps, gave the day its pattern. Early in the morning and late in the evening, the duty officer went through the accommodation. Once a week, we went to the baths to bathe. Hygiene and cleanliness were especially important. Gryasno, dirty, was one of the first Russian words I learned, from a Soviet doctor's assistant who expected painful cleanliness in the rooms. Even the generals took this young woman seriously when she entered the rooms and looked at the floors, beds, and windows with critical eyes. Our conversation in the first days and weeks turned overwhelmingly to everyday camp matters, to individual episodes in the Cauldron Battle on the Volga, to previous personal experiences, and to families back home. Everyone tried to grasp the concept of imprisonment. Deep discussions about the causes of the catastrophe on the Volga, about blame and guilt, and about its effect on the further progress of the war were temporarily avoided, perhaps because we were all in a kind of mental paralysis, a kind of trance, after the frightful experiences we had gone through, or because our individual consciences were switched off from any connection with Stalingrad and the tragic German defeat in the war against the hated Bolshevism. But life went on, the war too. After the inferno of the destructive battle, a person with the least spiritual substance could not just dream about food and revel in memories. He needed a new sense of life, a new support, and a real hope. He needed to escape from the relentless, honorable self-respect in personal ways and in the ways of our people that had led us to defeat. It applied too to any dealings with the Soviet state, with its social order and its goals, especially with the sources of its might and strength that we had apparently so rudely underestimated. In this concern with understanding oneself, books were valuable assistants. In the camp, there was an extensive library equipped with the finest fiction and political literature in the German language. The library came under a German NCO called Bayer. No one was obliged to serve themselves, nor did anyone have to sign for the books taken out. Once our lives had begun to take on a regular pattern again and the usual sources of conversation were exhausted, I went to the library to find my way around. For over a quarter of an hour I leafed through the registers, and then I selected several German classical romances and books for Paulus and Schmidt. Almost all the prisoners were then asking for fiction. One day, when I had already become a keen user of the librarian offered me some of the brochures lying on a display table. These were explanatory texts against Hitler. I knew that these were hardly ever read by the officers, but nevertheless I picked up several copies and read the titles and some extracts here and there. I did not like the language at all. It was full of fascism, imperialism, militarism, revenge. It seemed to me as if some things were simply asserted but not proved. I did not feel interested and therefore did not take the brochures with me. But I went off with a blue-bound book entitled The Land of Socialism, Today and Tomorrow. It contained the Central Committee's report on the 18th Party Day of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, the 10th March 1939. The book fascinated me because it gave me for the first time a representation of the development of society, economy, and culture in the Soviet Union. This brought comparisons with Ukraine, whose backwardness I had got to know during the First World War as a young second lieutenant and orderly officer of a German infantry brigade. I took the book in order to learn more about the Soviet Union, especially about socialism. I also wanted to concern myself with the works of Marx and Engels for the theoretical basis of socialism. I had heard their names at school in connection with the 1848 revolution. Otherwise, I knew only that Karl Marx had written a thick book about capitalism. So I asked for Das Kapital at the camp library. I read some of it, but did not understand the meaning of it. There were ideas in it that I had never heard of before in my life. I lacked not only the knowledge, but also the will to conduct a successful study of this work. Disappointed, I returned the book. I got on better with the works of Friedrich Engels. I followed his historical works, especially his military historical dissertation, with great interest. By then I was not far from a new, firm, mental point of view. But from the first day of captivity I did not count myself as one of Hitler's obstinate, inveterate followers. Full of indignation, I saw how those officers and generals who I knew had condemned Hitler and his system in Stalingrad now appeared to have forgotten everything. when one day I heard two officers greet each other with Heil Hitler, loudly and demonstratively on the camp road, I was at first glance inclined to think it had been a mental derangement. Soon, however, I had to accept that there were many among the generals and officers who remained fanatical adherents of Hitler, despite their experiences on the Volga. Among them were Colonel General Horst and Lieutenant General Arthur Schmidt, the Sixth Army's former chief of staff. Some of the stress that I had felt in living together with him was rooted in his radical approval of the war. My hatred of Hitler and his rule was reinforced when I discovered that the Führer had forbidden the dispatch of Red Cross postcards written by members of our families. How happy I was, like all the other occupants of the camp, at last to receive the first card in March 1943. Thus, within a few weeks, my wife and daughter would be relieved of their worst concerns, and we could write a card every month. In fact, the next card arrived in April. Then came a rumor that shocked me. Hitler had declared in a radio address to the German people that the Stalingraders were dead. We wanted to know for certain, so we asked both the Soviet camp commandant and the German anti-fascists who visited our camp. Hitler's betrayal of the members of the Sixth Army was confirmed by both parties. We had already been 2 months in Krasnogorsk when the Soviet duty officer and an interpreter appeared in our cabin one afternoon and announced the camp commandant's orders. "Get ready. The generals and Colonel Adam are being moved to another camp, rations to be collected immediately." This was on the 25th April, a warm spring day. We were ready to go within half an hour, but we had to wait for the order to go outside. The day was already coming to an end when we assembled with our baggage at the barrack gate. We were called forward by name and climbed into a bus, only Paulus taking a seat in a car. The escort was divided up between 2 trucks. Then we set off for Moscow. It was dark when we neared the outskirts. On the right side of the street ranged multi-storied houses, some only partly completed. Most still had scaffolding around them. The interpreter explained to me that the building work had had to be abandoned on the outbreak of war. During the night we crossed Moscow from west to east. The broad streets were unlit and almost empty of people. In one square the interpreter indicated the large buildings of the Belarusian railway station. At last we left the sea of buildings behind us. We were so strongly bumped about on the rough country roads that sleep was out of the question for a long time. Finally fatigue overtook us and conversation died down. I too dozed off until a loud snore behind me woke me with a start. I looked at the time. Midnight had passed. Somewhere between sleeping and waking, I noticed we were passing several large villages and later a town. Day was beginning. I was finally awake. "Where are we?" I asked the interpreter. He gave a sleepy reply. "In Vladimir," which did not stop me asking, "How much longer will it take until we reach our destination?" "You will soon see for yourself," he said. Our vehicle was fast approaching a small town. The copper roofs of numerous towers were visible from afar in the spring sunlight. This was Sustal, an old prince's and bishop's seat. We went through the massive open gate of a fortress wall with its loopholes and defensive towers to a long building complex, whose center point was a church with 5 onion towers and a bell tower standing before it. Along the sides crouched long buildings of 1 or 2 stories used as accommodation for officer prisoners of war. The commandant, Colonel Novikov, a wiry officer with a light but ringing commanding voice, took us to our quarters. I was allocated a room with Schmidt. As in Krasnogorsk, the first days in Suzdal were taken up with adjusting to our changed circumstances. Suzdal offered material for several interesting studies. It was the former capital of the Sustal Kingdom, one of the 3 Russian principalities after those of Novgorod and Kiev. Its fortress-like appearance was due to the former danger from the Tartars. Until the fall of the Shars it had formed, with its vast acreage, one of the trading bastions most closely connected with the Tsar and the Church. It had become a dreamy country town, and now it housed within its walls prisoners of war, officers of the Romanian, Hungarian, Italian, and German armies. In the months of June and July I experienced the famous white nights here. Up until midnight, it was so light that one could read outside. Equally wonderful were the early morning hours and the time shortly before sundown. Nature, buildings and people took on such splendid colors under the flood of light as I have never experienced before or since. Looking back, the stay in Suzdal left a lasting impression on me. On one of the warm summer evenings of 1943, I had an encounter with Professor Arnold. He had come to Sustal from Moscow and was expressly at the disposal of the generals and officers. Most of us had questions and problems enough. Arnold seemed to me to be small in stature, but soon after his first words I noted that I had a spirited, extraordinary, highly intellectual man in front of me, a clever, kindly person to converse with, who had an exceptional command of the German language. Our conversation quickly revealed the character of an informal conversationalist, although our talk soon became heated when we spoke about German history of the last 150 years. History had always interested me, and not only professionally as a former teacher. I had worked my way through the works of Treitschke, Seibel, Rank, and many others. I was proud of my knowledge of history and imagined I had a firm view of it. Professor Arnold proved that in the disastrous course of German history, in the decisive points of 1813, 1848, 1870-71, 1918, and 1933, it was not the German people, not the Democrats, but the anti-democratic forces that had won. The people had fought well and made sacrifices, but politically they had always been defrauded of the fruits of their fighting. And further, the German people had been misused, unlike any other people, for a war that was not in the national interest, but for the self-seeking conquests and goals of its ruling elite. Please understand me correctly, said Professor Arnold. I am far from contradicting the German people's great humanitarian traditions, their towering contribution to the spiritual treasure chamber of humanity. Already we Soviet people treasure the greatness of those German spiritual giants, Goethe and Schiller, Kant and Hegel, Bach and Beethoven, Kepler and Einstein, not to mention Marx and Engels, who have really become the teachers in our country. But think of Bismarck, the Prussian junker who had boundless contempt for democracy and the will of the people. Excuse me, I interrupted him. But Bismarck was the blacksmith of German unity, the creator of the Reich. Certainly Bismarck had shown an understanding of the historical necessity that German unification had long since put on the agenda. But please consider how and by what forces the German Kaiserreich of 1871 was grounded. When Bismarck became Minister-President of Prussia in 1862, he proclaimed that the problems of the time would be decided not by liberal ideas, but by blood and iron. The Reich came about as a result of 3 wars. It was founded in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, not by the German people, but by the German princes. The princes, not the then already economically leading burghers, had the political power of the Kaiserreich in their hands. They were, however, ultimately responsible to God for their deeds. I don't understand your criticism of Bismarck's politics. He was all for good neighborly relations with Russia and concluded the German-Russian Reassurance Agreement. Let us leave open the question whether Bismarck really wanted good neighborly relations with Russia, said Arnold, taking up my objection, and let us look overall at the motives for his Russian policy, which for me seem to have been dictated more by fear than by friendship, for one has to recognize certain realistic aims of his foreign policies. Bismarck, as a statesman, was in this aspect much more far-sighted than that lunatic Hitler. Had Hitler learned from Bismarck at this stage, all of us would have been spared much suffering. Apart from this, Hitler has taken many negative things from Bismarck's policies: the hatred of democracy, worker mobility and socialism, the struggle for power, war-lusting National Socialism, social demagogy. From the Bismarck era, a straight line leads directly into the chauvinism of Wilhelm II and to the excessive conquest plans of Hitler, with which you too, Herr Adam, have been involved. You are talking about the same things in German history, Professor Arnold. It so happens that I have studied history myself and believe that I know at least something about it. For me, Bismarck is the outstanding statesman of his time. Perhaps your criticism has a touch of envy, and Hitler may have made some bad mistakes. But as a German, I cannot describe everything that has happened in Germany in the last 10 years as bad. Certainly not everything has been bad in Germany in the last 10 years. There are Germans, too, who with commitment, and often at the cost of their lives, fight against Hitler. What, however, has been very bad is that Hitler's Germany has assaulted other people and taken them over by war. Now that has to be bitterly paid for. We parted without having agreed, but still it was beginning to dawn on me that we were operating from different basic positions. Professor Arnold considered historical development and historical events strongly from the standpoint of the masses. He saw the true driving force of history in the workers, farmers, businesses, manual laborers, and other working strata of the people. He assessed at the same time a scale for the evaluation of historical precedents and the historical acts of individual persons, even the acts of German generals and officers, including mine. The professor said that in this war we were pursuing a bad thing, that we were conducting an illegal war. Rights, morals, and historical precedent were not on our side. For some 2,000 kilometers from Germany's borders, we were trying to deliver a deadly blow to the Soviet Union. Rights and historical progress stood and remained on the side of the Soviet people and its Red Army, which was defending its homeland and its established order of society with its blood sacrifice. The words of the Soviet professor worked within me like a thorn. I tried to wipe it away, but the thorn did not weaken, just bored deeper in. The questions raised occupied me day and night. I was angry with myself because I had been so arrogant in my conversation with him and had not simply accepted the arguments of my partner in our discussion, but I really wanted to investigate his point of view. No real opinion can be formed with a door-rejecting attitude. Counter-argument must be through much more fundamentally and critically. Dear friends, that's all for today. Please support my channel with any comment. Thanks a lot. It was Tim, and see you.